Start, right?
Yeah.
All right, let's do it. Hi, everybody. I'm Alicia Holland. I'm a professor in the government department. Before we start, I just have a couple of announcements. So first, the Ash Center acknowledges the land on which Harvard University sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. Today's discussion is being recorded and will be made available on the Ash Center's YouTube page. And we're really lucky today that today's talk is jointly organized. So first, it's part of the Ash Center's Global Challenges to Democracy series, which is organized by Imelda Gonzalez and Gautam Nair, with support from Melissa Danello and Sophie Koritz. And it's also co-sponsored today by the Government Department's Comparative Politics Workshop, which I run along with Ho Jung Ju and Lucia Mendoza, who's down there. No? Okay, maybe she didn't make it. We're also on strike today, so it's, you know, anyhow. We are so happy to have Rory Truex here with us. Rory's an associate professor at Princeton University's Politics Department. Most importantly, he was class of '07 with me at Princeton, so go Tigers. And his first book, Making Autocracy Work, Representation and Responsiveness in Modern China, came out with Cambridge University Press in 2016 and received the Leon Epstein Outstanding Book Award. He's published on a range of themes around representation and public opinion in China, pretty much all the top journals of the discipline, APSR, Journal of Politics, etc. He also writes for broad audiences in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and hosts the Civic Forum, a weekly public speaker series on democracy between scholars and practitioners. So we're so thrilled that Rory is shifting his research from authoritarianism in China to potentially authoritarianism in the United States. And thank you for joining us. Rory's going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. And I just want to start by saying, you know, I'm at Princeton, and I've been really following the activities of the Ash Center for a while now, and I really admire what you're building and what you're doing and that kind of thought leadership you're providing about democracy and authoritarianism in this moment. So it's a great honor for me to get to interact with you all and be part of this community, if only for a day. So as Alicia mentioned, I'm a China scholar by training. And actually, when I came into the China field, one thing I was doing when I was in grad school was I was reading a lot of literature on American politics, which is a very developed subfield. And I was thinking, well, how can I take some of these ideas and research designs and try to execute them and amend them in China? And now, as the world has evolved, oddly, I'm finding that a lot of that work and experience working on authoritarianism and the broader field of authoritarian politics has become, unfortunately, increasingly relevant in the American context. And so now I'm becoming an American politics scholar. Not really. I only have a couple of papers on this, but I co-author with Americanists, and they keep me honest. So today I'm going to present a very, very, very preliminary piece of research. The working paper is not out yet, and that's good for me because I get to get your feedback about which directions to go. It's co-authored with two of our graduate students, Fatima Al-Samak, Jace Pollard, and then Kevin R. Snow, who's a professor at Sciences Po. And it's about the big lie. It's about this idea of how the Republican Party came to endorse or condone the idea that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. In terms of our motivations for this particular study, many years ago, Vin and I did our first project on this. If we rewind back to that 2020 election, right? It was the height of COVID. We were all sitting at home, maybe living in our parents' house with our children. I don't know what you were doing, but we were getting through some hard times together. And at the time, we knew the election, the upcoming election in 2020 was going to be a bit interesting. And so Vin and I, at the time, set up this thing which we call the Election Legitimacy Tracking Survey, where we started to poll people every day, about 500 respondents per day in the lead up to the election, on a range of different topics. This is actually a very strange project design because we didn't know what would unfold in 2020, but we were like, this will probably be interesting. And frankly, obviously, it became a contested election. There was January 6th. And so we had planned to only do the survey for about 2 or 3 weeks. We wound up continuing it through the end of January and trying to scrap together money. But it was during this project where we saw the big lie emerge in real time. And I remember downloading the data every day and seeing, oh no, Republicans, voters don't really believe this result. So we had a very simple question. This is from our old study about who do you believe won the election? And this was the election day, and these are different events. This is when the race was actually called. And then, of course, we have things unfolding into January. But we observed a very stable proportion of the American electorate believe Biden won, and it's about 70% or so. And that was very sticky. We were expecting this to maybe rise as events unfolded. The election was certified. We had some Republican elites call out that the election was in fact valid. But it stayed very sticky, and of course we saw this partisan divergence. That's that same chart. These are our daily samples cut by the party of the respondent. And so we see Democrats overwhelmingly believe Biden won. Independents, about 70% or so, 60 to 70%. And then Republican voters, this was what was quite striking, right? So this is in the immediate aftermath of 2020. And we see that roughly 30 to 35% of Republicans are willing, only 30 to 35% are willing to say that Biden won the election. And so that was the kind of big lie unfolding in real time. And 4 years went by, and at the time we also did a conjoint experiment. A conjoint is when you randomly give people options. It's a survey design that actually originated in marketing. And we gave Republican respondents a hypothetical primary candidate, and we randomly assigned whether or not the candidate endorsed the big lie or said that the election was valid. And we found at the time that candidates at that moment that endorsed the big lie on the Republican side would have a significant electoral advantage, about 5 to 8 percentage points. And we wrote at the time, this is going to come off as self-congratulatory, but I bring it up because rarely are we right in political science about much of anything, but we did get it right, and we were writing pretty early on this. It makes it difficult for Republican leaders to take a stand against the big lie and requires them to at least pretend that the foundation of American democracy is broken. The big lie around the 2020 election has allowed Trump to dominate other Republican elites in a fashion not dissimilar from how leaders in authoritarian systems force their citizens to perpetuate lies. So we wrote that sentence in 2021. And at the time, I think many of us thought that the story was going to be over, like the lie would peter out, Trump would face some electoral consequences. And of course, as we know, that hasn't been the case. So we now know that election deniers inhabit a large part of the U.S. government, especially in elected offices. This is data from an organization called States United, which tracks election denialism. According to them, there's 155 different people in Congress right now that deny the results of the 2020 election. We can talk more about what denialism means, how this is measured, but in general, what we're seeing is that this type of person is very much alive and well in the political system. We know that...
Are you going to talk about it more, Rory?
I'm going to talk about it, yeah.
Right.
I got you. Let me...
I just want to figure out, like, what do they mean by this? Like, that Trump didn't do anything. Because that could mean many different things.
So let me get there, and if I don't get there, you can bring it up again. Is that all right? Got it. So the other thing we see is that the use of the lie has become what we call a litmus test or a loyalty test throughout the Republican Party, not just in elected office. So we know that the RNC was asking job applicants, particularly young job applicants, how they felt about the 2020 election as almost like a screener for loyalty to Trump himself. And then we've seen events like this. If you rewind back to that Waltz-Vance debate, that was oddly pleasant for a little while, right? They were kind of very collegial with each other. But then there was this pointed moment, which I think was very telling, which Tim Walz said, I think a revisionist history on this. This was a threat to our democracy in a way that we had not seen, and it manifested itself because of Donald Trump's inability to say, he is still saying he didn't lose the election. I would just ask that, did he lose the 2020 election? This is Tim Walz putting Vance on the spot on the national stage. And if you recall, J.D. Vance says, Tim, I'm focused on the future. Doesn't answer the question, did Kamala Harris censor Americans from speaking their mind in the wake of the 2020 COVID situation? And then Walz says that is a damning non-answer. This is an example of what, starting to get to your question a little bit, this is what we might call obfuscation. So he's not saying, no, Trump won. He's just refusing to answer the question. So there's different subtypes of denialism. And we can talk more about how we try to deal with this in the paper and think about it. But I'll develop more on that, Gautam. And then, of course, just in this last week, we basically saw the same type of event unfold. Your very own Elizabeth Warren grilling Kevin Warsh, who's the potential candidate to be the Fed, grilling him on his ability to be independent from Trump. So independence takes courage. Let's check out your independence and your courage. We'll start easy, Mr. Warsh. Did Donald Trump lose the 2020 election? And he says, well, we try to keep politics, if I'm confirmed, out of the federal bubble. And then she interrupts him. I'm just asking you a factual question. I need to measure your independence and your courage. Senator, I believe this body certified that election many years ago. That's not the question I'm asking. I'm asking, did Trump lose in 2020? And he ultimately does not answer the question and changes the subject about interest rates, I think. So the lie is alive and well. And we see Republican elites continue to refuse to talk about the 2020 election as a valid result. And so the question that we're trying to answer in this paper, building on what we did in 2020, is how did this unfold? How did this process unfold over time? How did the Republican Party come to be dominated by election deniers, or at least inhabited by election deniers? And this is actually a very massive undertaking. As we've gone through the project, it's gotten bigger and bigger over time. And one thing I would love your help on is how do we scope and scale this and make this into a tractable paper? At times it feels like it's becoming a book, which it could be, and maybe there's enough there to make it a book. But we've done a few things that I want to share with you today. The first is we replicated our own study from 2020. So we did the same design in 2024, again, not knowing how the election would unfold and who would win and how it would, but we set up the same thing again. We also look at election denial at the elite level and whether or not that has electoral consequences. So is it the case that people who deny the result of the election, how do they fare in the actual electoral process? And then we're starting to do a little bit more work on Trump's own behavior and how he's using social media in particular to enforce the lie and basically punish people who defect. And what we're trying to argue in the paper is that this ecosystem represents what we call a mass-mediated loyalty test. It's a very unique political situation that we're actually having trouble finding analogs in much of the rest of the world. And I would love for the comparativists in the room to give me some more examples. Where basically what's happening is Trump is mobilizing his supporters to punish elected officials in particular for deviating from the big lie. And so a lot of loyalty testing is between the leader and other members of the elite, but this is an interesting example where his popularity with the Republican electorate is allowing him to enforce this notion that he wants, and it continues to persist, and it puts Republican elected officials in a very uncomfortable situation. So we hope that our contribution is this idea of the loyalty test and the mass-mediated loyalty test in particular. So let me tell you a little bit about the work that we're kind of fitting into, and then I'll tell you what I mean by a loyalty test, and we'll get into some of the findings. And again, this is very preliminary, so all feedback is welcome, and I think the results are largely in place, but we might need to make some tweaks over time. So in terms of the existing research, obviously there's a huge body of work on democratic backsliding and erosion, a lot of it done by your people, who I've admired for many years. So we believe that this is a case study of democratic erosion around the specific process of elections. We know that leaders like Trump trash talk democracy. This is Sue Stokes' phrase. They trash talk democratic institutions in order to undermine them and make the space politically to try to grab power. So there is a huge literature that we're fitting into there. Today I did want to just briefly walk you through an authoritarian politics literature, because I think that's maybe what we bring to the table here in terms of enriching the American politics literature. So there's a lot of work on loyalty in authoritarian contexts, and I will give you the high-level insights. The first is that dictators in general seem to place a political premium on loyalty, often at the expense of competence. And we talk about a loyalty competence trade-off. And we might think, well, why wouldn't they want someone who's both loyal and competent? Well, it turns out if you have competent people around you, often they're more threatening to you, right? They might be more likely to move against you. And so often we see dictators elevate the deliberately incompetent because they are less threatening. Often if they're like broken, right? If they're politically broken and would not have the job without that person, that further binds them, right? And if you look at Trump's cabinet, and I won't name names, but a lot of these people are deeply flawed people. He tried to put Matt Gaetz in the cabinet, right? A lot of them, Kash Patel, Hegseth, none of these people would be anywhere near power if it weren't for their loyalty to Trump. And so we know that there's a loyalty premium, certainly in authoritarian settings, because the authoritarian political game is much higher stakes. It's often very violent, and so they place a premium on loyalty. In backsliding contexts, you can imagine like having these lieutenants around you that are willing to execute your orders is particularly important because you're trying to maybe break the law or fundamentally change the system. So number one, loyalty really, really matters for these types of leaders. Finding number two is what I would call competitive sycophancy. So we know in the authoritarian world that when you have a system like this, we see these lower level elites or members of the ruling coalition go bend over backwards to fawn over the dictator in order to demonstrate loyalty and maybe get attention and promotion. This is very common in the authoritarian world. There's a great paper in the China field by Victor Xi, who's at UCSD now, and he calls it nauseating displays of loyalty, and he looks at, I think this is the Jiang Zemin period, lower level provincial officials mirroring the language of Jiang Zemin, this idea of the three represents, and he shows that in doing so, they debase themselves, right? So if they engage in this nauseating displays, they humiliate themselves in a way, and that binds them to the leader. There's a lot of nauseating things happening in DC right now, and people humiliating themselves, frankly. I mean, even the little thing with the shoes, remember when they're all wearing the same shoes and they don't fit? It's just very bizarre, frankly. But I see a fair amount of competitive sycophancy unfolding in the US at this point, the kind of dear leader cabinet meetings that we're seeing. And then finding three is this finding, I know, I'm not comparing Trump to this person, but I just say in the authoritarian world, we also know that rituals and domination are a key part of this. So Lisa Wedeen has a lot of work in her book, Ambiguities of Domination, which is on Syria, about how these leaders will put their populations in particular through loyalty rituals that humiliate them and dominate them, and that's part of the point. This happens at the elite level as well. There's countless examples of this in the authoritarian world. This is one of my favorites. This is Idi Amin. This is Idi Amin's full title, according to Idi Amin, which I will not read to you, but if you actually read it out loud, it takes about 15 to 20 seconds to read that. He would require his subordinates to address him by that all the time, right? So that's another kind of dominance ritual. In North Korea, we saw this play out with the death of Kim Jong-il. Both the population and then elites were banned from laughing for 10 to 11 days after he died, and this commemoration actually happened again 10 years later. And people who didn't show sincere mourning for the dear leader were purged and sent to re-education through labor. So those are some of the three big findings. Now, what's shocking to me is that according to what I can find, there is nobody who's formally defined this idea of a loyalty test in the academic literature, from what I can tell. And I would love to be corrected on that, because then I could just use that person's definition. Loyalty testing and loyalty tests, this is a concept we see all the time. So if you look at public discourse on American politics or other places, we see people using this phrase. But from what I can tell, it's not been defined. And so this is our effort to put a definition out there. I would welcome your feedback, because this is very, very preliminary. And defining a concept actually is one of the harder things to do, I think, in comparative, because you have to get it just right. So when I think of a loyalty test, this is what I'm thinking of. A deliberate attempt by a leader to assess a subordinate's political loyalty by inducing them to engage in dishonest, embarrassing, violent, or illicit behavior on the leader's behalf. And the key thing here is, first of all, I'm focused at the elite level. So there's loyalty testing. You could argue that some of the dominance rituals I just mentioned, that's loyalty testing at the citizen to state level. Like I studied China, like loyalty testing in the Mao era was part of the system, but that was at the mass level. Here I am defining it at the elite level. And the point is that the person is somehow compromising their integrity. They're doing something that makes them look bad or kind of breaks their spirit in some way. That might be illegal behavior, humiliating behavior, and so forth. But that's a key feature of this. It might be in public. It might be just in front of the leader. It might be violent or non-violent. We know that, like when Saddam Hussein came to power, he forced other members of the Ba'ath Party to execute their own colleagues. And so there can be different forms of this. And the key distinction we try to make in the paper is between what we call leader-mediated and mass-mediated loyalty testing. So in a standard like leader-mediated loyalty test, it's just between the leader and that member of the ruling coalition. And we can think of this like it's the typical purge or promote. If you pass my test, you'll get the promotion. If you don't, I'm going to purge you. And then elites have this sort of decision to defect or affirm. That's the standard stuff that we see in the authoritarian world when we think of like the kind of ruling court of an authoritarian regime. This is core to it. Now, I think what's interesting is there is this other dynamic that can unfold that I think is actually very unusual, and this is how I would characterize a lot of what's happening in the US right now is the leader mobilizes or demobilizes the population, and this typically can work if the leader is very popular, maybe there's a cult of personality, and then the population is the one doing the punishing and the rewarding. And that punishing or rewarding might be electoral, like we see in the US. It might be violent, like we see, there's other examples I might be able to talk about. But so the punishment is actually throwing to the population, and then the elite are trying to signal their loyalty to the leader, and it's sort of this circular thing. So it's the relationship between the leader and the population that makes this work. So this is how we're thinking about this. And then in the paper, what we try to do is just describe how this is unfolding in the US. This is kind of an unusual political science paper in that it doesn't have one neat hypothesis or anything. We're just sort of describing, it's almost like a quantitative case study of the last 4 years. And there's a question of whether that's working or what other things we might do. So what are we going to try to do in the paper, and what am I going to try to show you today, or most of this today, is can this 2020 dynamic in the Republican Party be understood through this lens of a loyalty test and this mass-mediated loyalty test? How did this unfold, and what's unique about it? And I'm going to try to show you 3 things, which are probably not news to you. These are I don't think, particularly wild or controversial findings, but I think there is value to just showing them with data and giving you hard numbers as to what they look like. So finding 1 is Republican voters continue to believe the 2020 election was stolen. It hasn't really rebounded all that much. We can show that with our data. 2, President Trump continues to mobilize the population against elites who defect from the lie. And then 3, there continues to be a substantial electoral benefit for Republican candidates who engage in denialism, especially in 2024 and especially in primary settings. This might change, right? Like that's what's also interesting is that this story isn't over, and that's one of the questions we're grappling with is when is this project done? It's called The Life of the Lie. If the lie continues to live on, do we just keep, like I think we'll probably not try to publish the paper until after the 2026 election. I think there's good reason to think we should replicate what we've done actually in the upcoming midterms. But I would love to get your feedback on that. How are we doing on time? I'm just rambling here. We're all right, yeah? All right.
Can I just clarify one thing,
Please.
Rory, which is in the theory, how does obfuscation fit in? Like, does that mute this sort of mass-mediated loyalty cycle? Or if you're obfuscating, can you still mobilize to the same?
So this is one thing I think we need to pin down better. And when we say denialism, it actually encompasses a range of behaviors. So you have people who will say, Donald Trump won. It was rigged with fraud. He won. Then you'll have people who did what actually J.D. Vance did, which is he said, I'm not really going to talk about that, right? So he's basically protecting himself. He's not going out against his boss. But he's not going full on conspiracy theory, this was stolen. And there's a range of behaviors, right? And those are kind of the 2 dominant strategies, like obfuscation versus outright denialism. And right now, the issue is measuring this is quite challenging. This is one thing we're bumping into in the project is how do you measure someone's position? Right now, we're using data from this organization called States United, which is a nonprofit that actually has a ton of political scientists working for it, and they've been tracking denialism over time.
But just on theoretical
terms.
Like if you obfuscate, can you mobilize the masses in your cycle, or does that break down the mass mediation?
Like if the elite does, if the
elite basically says, I'm not going to talk about it, it seems like if your theory is contingent on mass mobilization being a sort of pressure, then I don't know.
Lose that. It's an interest. It's a good question, a really good question. I think What it does, my guess is that one thing we observe, and I'll show you the results, is that engaging in denialism, which at this point in our analysis encompasses both behaviors, seems to have an electoral benefit. But there are gradations in the level of that, right? And so my guess is it's going to be contingent on where you are, right? So if you're in a deep red pro-Trump district, the kind of obfuscation might not be enough to please the primary, but it might be good for the general. There's also a tension you can see in the data between primary elections and general elections, where these people have to be pro-Trump enough to win the primary and not get primaried by someone he likes more, but they're not so crazy as to lose the general. And they're trying to battle those different pressures. But I think what you're getting at, Alicia, is theoretically we need to think more about these subcategories and how I like what you're saying. Like we can think differently about this. Might not be de facto firm. Like we need to be a little bit more precise there. I think that's great feedback. Thank you.
Who does the interpretation? Is it the masses, or does the leader give a cue to the masses about whether it's sort of above or below the board?
All right, I'm going to write these things down because these are great feedback.
Because that could resolve that issue. It seems to be what's going on in my reading.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's happening is it's both. So Trump will intervene in these races, right? And he will use Twitter he'll Truth Social. He'll post truths, which are often lies, which is one of the great ironies of this moment. But yeah, so he will intervene, right? And he will decide often whether someone has passed the test or not. And you can tell very clearly whether someone's gotten on his bad side. But he doesn't do that all the time, and I think so. It's some of it is just like mass interpretation, but I think a lot of it is this top down of like signaling to the population, this guy's good enough, he's on our team. Like J.D. Vance has passed the test, right? For now. We'll see. There's inklings that J.D. Vance is maybe on the outs with Trump. We don't quite know. But I do think it's primarily the leader is deciding who's passed the test or not. I think that's my instinct, but I have to think through that more. But that's a good piece of feedback. Yeah.
Yeah, on this point, I think there's a paper by Jin Yuan Chen at Boston College about how if you already have stable loyalty with the leader, you have more slack and you actually can obfuscate more because you don't need to pass the test. Like you're already considered an insider. So I can see like this very interesting, like potentially endogenous relationship between like the type of strategy that these elites can employ depending on existing levels of loyalty, like personal loyalty with the leader. So maybe there is some like degree of the leader mediated model that's affecting the mass mediated model. But yeah,
I don't know that paper actually, so let me get the citation from you at some point.
Can I just follow
The
up?
build on question, yeah.
When you were asking the question, were you defining the member of an elite who's strategizing in managing his relationship with the boss and everybody else, right? Is that
Yeah.
what you had in mind? I think this is what's so interesting about this, because in some sense, this is a very complicated dynamic model.
Yeah.
It's now sort of truncated into these two sections, right? But in fact, what's interesting about this is how the dynamics develop over time, when it goes one way and when it starts collapsing and going back. And so, and an interesting question then is, what is it reasonable to imagine that a statistical, serious political science study could tell us about the details of that dynamic? And this is the question about case studies versus all the statistical methods we have in political science, right? Because the statistical methods typically show us states, they don't show us dynamics, right? And they don't show us the processes by which the dynamics start running one way rather than another, and how sensitive that needle is, right? And it seems to me like with respect to that question, our usual social science instruments feel pretty primitive and unable to get to a confident answer about that. They can sort of show us the possibilities and sort of the likelihood. But it's a little bit hard to know how you could model this system and test its reliability statistically.
Yes, and I think we have a ways to go with this paper. So but let me tell you.
Making a more fundamental claim.
No, I have some ideas about I think you're both correct in this. First of all, to your question about your status with the leader and how it might relate to what you have to do. I think in other parts of the in the authoritarian world, certainly in the Chinese context, which is what I study, you see this dynamic where weaker members of the ruling coalition are the ones who have to be most sycophantic because they got to get his attention. They have to get Xi Jinping's attention or whoever it is at the time. And so it could be the case that some of these, especially in these primary elections where someone's running for the first time, they go over the top to signal their loyalty to Trump. Whereas if you're someone more established, like you don't feel like you have an independent base of support, or maybe you have a good relationship with the president. So that would be something that we maybe could incorporate theoretically and empirically. To your question, I think you're spot on, which is the dynamic nature of this system is really important. And what I'm going to show you is probably going to fall short of what we need. One, we don't have good measures of denialism over time. So it's hard to track. We have a binary indicator for are you a denier or not? And that's coming from this nonprofit. What we need is a better, more granular measure. We're able to track this at the individual level over time. We're looking into using people's congressional letters and emails as a way to do this. But the other thing I think we should do, honestly, as a comparativist, is just start interviewing people.
I agree.
And I think that we don't see that a lot in American politics for whatever reason, but I think if we did 150 emails with people close to the Republican Party, not necessarily Congress people, but their staff, I think we would learn a lot about the electoral calculations that people are making. And I think that to me sounds like a book more than what we're able to put in this paper. But I think that would enrich the story for sure.
You're describing this sort of multi-level game theoretic approach, right, at some level to this, which is you've got a leader, he's making calculations about how much he's control and can he increase his control by lying more or lying less or accommodating. You've got a lot of people at different stages at the elite making that same kind of strategic calculation. And you got people, ordinary citizens, deciding how they're going to react to what they see around them and what's happening. We're in the middle of that right at the moment now, because the question is, people are saying, oh, the Trump coalition is falling apart. Well, how do we know that? I mean, I can't even imagine exactly what data I would want to have available to me to answer the question whether that's true and to make a reliable prediction about whether it's going to go.
Yeah, well, and I take your point, and I think one thing that we might be able to enrich is to say, well, the power of this test depends on the leadership, the link between the leader and the population. And what we do, I think, is fair to say is we know that Trump is losing a little bit of his base of support. People are upset about the Iran war. There's parts of the Republican Party that are upset about Epstein. A lot of the Republican influencer class has turned on him. And so I think these Republican congressional candidates are actually stuck because once they get through the primaries, we might see them pivot more towards the middle. But on the one hand, they need Trump's support. They don't want him to turn against them. But on the other hand, he's an anchor on them. And so that would be another interesting thing we could think about would be how does this behavior change through even just an election cycle? So I think getting to that more granular level will be necessary. In terms of a formal model, now that hearing you say this, there's a world in which a good model might be helpful for us. Unfortunately, I technically have a master's in econ, but in doing that, I learned that I'm basically a C+ economist. So I don't have the tools myself, but it's possible. I think that would be interesting if we can find someone to work on that with us.
The economists don't have very good dynamic models of anything either.
Let's let you get to your empirics, and then we can keep going, okay?
But these are all, this is what we can see. This is super helpful, very, very, very helpful. Thank you. All right, where were we? Okay, so let me just show you some data. And I'll show you what we have, and then I'd love to hear your reactions to it, and then also directions you think would be productive, because I think this paper needs to continue. So one thing we did is we just asked people to see if people would correctly identify the winner of the election. This is comparing our 2020 data to our 2024 data. And so the kind of solid lighter gray here is the percentage of Americans over time, days from the election, that identified Biden as the winner. We see it settle in at around 70%. And then we asked the same question in 2044, who won the election and how many people identified Trump as the winner. And it's roughly 90%. So there was more acceptance. This is not really about our paper, but this is, I just think, an interesting descriptive fact. There was more acceptance of the election in general in 2024. There are a fair number of Democrats who won't say that Trump won in 2024. And it's a question, about 15 to 20% of them won't. That's interesting. And it's a question of, is that expressive survey responding? And there's always, anytime you have data like this, do people really feel this way, or are they just angrily mashing a survey button? There was a election conspiracy narrative actually in the left around the 2024 election, around Musk, and I don't know if you remember that whole chapter where people thought the election machines were rigged. So
And after the 2016 election,
yeah, so there's
that was a huge.
so there's a narrative, there's an emerging dynamic in the American electorate where people don't fully accept the results if their side lost, and that the left, the Democratic Party, is not immune from that. I think it's noteworthy, but yeah.
Was this conditional on attention tests?
Yeah. So we had some of that baked into the survey. And surveys are also, this is an aside, but surveys are getting harder and harder to run, and there's concern now that when you do, we're debating whether or not to do it again in 2026 because we're worried we're just going to get AI agents taking our survey, and so the whole survey enterprise is a little bit in jeopardy. But anyway, let me show you some other stuff. So this is kind of collapsing the data a little bit. This is asking people, who do you believe won the 2020 election? Each bar, we have independents. This is subsetting our sample by party. Independents, Republicans, Democrats, and then the full sample. And then there's 3 different periods. This is a little small for those of you in the back. This is right after the 2020 election. This is 2024, but before the election itself. And then this is 2024 after the election. And so what we see is that, okay, by the time we got to prior to the 2024 election, belief that Biden had won had gone even further down among the Republican electorate, down to only about 25% of Republicans just prior to the 2024 election thought that Biden won in 2020. We do see some rebound. So what's noteworthy is that after Trump won, we observed some small fraction of Republicans now more willing to say that Biden won in 2020. Maybe it restored their faith in the election process. But it didn't jump back to kind of it just reverted back to still that kind of 30% territory. So it did not restore people's faith in the electoral process, even seeing Trump won. I think that's our interpretation of this. Another interesting thing you can do is you can look at, you can use multi-level regression and post-stratification to construct state-level estimates of belief that Biden won. So the lighter red areas here this is just the point estimate for Republicans in our sample. So this is just Republican voters. What percentage of them believe Biden won in 2020? Okay, lighter red is higher, darker red is lower. And so this is right after the 2020 election. This is what we see is that there is variation here, national variation. So your Republican in Vermont, about 40% of them would say Biden won, compared to your Republican in West Virginia, who would say 26% of them would say Biden won. So there's regional variation here, notably the kind of bluer states. The Republicans embedded in those bluer states were slightly more likely to believe Biden actually won in 2020. That's what it looked like in 2020. This is what it looks like in 2024, which is the local variation basically collapses, and it's become this national narrative, and the percentages both go down but also cease to really vary over space. So basically every state, the Republicans in every state, it's usually 25 to 30% of them believe that Biden won in 2020. This is another way to kind of show that. This on the x-axis is the 2020 vote share for Trump in both graphs.